Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that I do not know, my name is Hank Knight. I'm director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at Keene State, professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And it is my good fortune to be in the position to moderate a conversation this afternoon with our guest, Ken Burns. Now, my guess is you don't need me to give you a long introduction of Ken Burns' work, other than to say he began his film career in 1981 with a film on the Brooklyn Bridge, and Ken is at 28 or 33 films later. You are still hard at work. We've got a number of Keene State-related folks that make the journey to Walpole, to Florentine Films on a regular basis as interns, and some are actually on your staff now, I believe. So we've got some very interesting connections between Keene State and Ken Burns. He's the recipient of 12 Emmys and I think 2 Oscar nominations. And we're simply delighted to have him with us for the next 55 minutes for conversation time. I'm going to pose an opening question to get us started, but I'm hoping that you will be filled with questions to ask our guest. I have some backups if you grow silent on me so that we're in good shape. But this is really your time with our guest, so please take advantage of that. Ken, if we could start, one of the things that I'm fascinated with is what, in my reading, I find is called the Ken Burns effect, and it's the kind of what I would call a contemplative approach to history and storytelling, where you linger with a photograph, a visual image, and in the lingering, you use music, carefully selected music, to help your viewers really spend time penetrating what the image is about. And one of the people I read put it this way: you help us listen to what we see, not just see what we see. Could you say more about this part of your approach?
Well, I think the general part of what you just described, every filmmaker would say. You know, you engage some audio and you engage some visual stuff, and you want people to stop and to think and to be absorbed in that. I think that this thing called the Ken Burns effect has sort of gotten out of hand. I have been interested in trying to wake up an old photograph. Traditionally, old photographs weren't used that much. And when they were sort of held at arm's length. And I was interested, being taught by still photographers, that there's a lot of, it's a kind of the DNA of our understanding of the visual world, and that I've always been interested in the soundtrack as much as the visual track. And so I had originally wanted to be a feature filmmaker, and so I took each still photograph that I put up on the easel in front of me as if it was a master shot that a feature filmmaker might have, that would then have a long shot, a medium, a close, a tilt, a pan, a reveal, an insert of details. And rather than just look at that photograph, I was also curious, respecting that the fact that it was an arrested moment of a moment that had its own past and future, that whether that car was making a sound as it went by, whether those troops were tramping, whether the cannon were firing, whether the bat was cracking. And that was important for me to try to bring that alive. So with complicated sound effects and music that was evocative of the period. So in December of 2002, I got a call from Steve Jobs, who said, "Would you come out and see me?" And I said, yes. And saw him about a week later in Cupertino, California, and he ushered me into a room where there were 2 tech guys who were beaming. They had spent years perfecting the ability to sort of do a very simple pan and zoom at the same time with photographs that you could put into your system in iPhoto. And Steve said that the next month, every Mac computer from then on would for free have this thing, and the working title was The Ken Burns Effect. And they wanted to keep the name, and I said, I don't do commercial endorsements. And he went, what? What? And I went into his office, and an hour later I came out, and Apple, gave me, over the years, several $100,000 worth of hardware and software, which I in turn gave away to nonprofit schools and libraries and nonprofits, and that was the way to do it. So it's a bit of the technological tail wagging the dog, but suffice to say there's lots of elements that we want to use to try to wake that moment up. And style, if you had to sort of come to some sort of glossary or an acceptance of definition, style, it would be just the authentic application of technique, right? So any artist, any craftsperson would have dozens of things at their disposal. I could simplify it to say that mine are 4 oral and 4 visual, and the visual are kind of obvious. We have those still photographs, we have moving footage, newsreel footage if you want to call it, we have interviews, and we have live modern cinematography of the now quiet locations. On the oral side, we have a third-person narrator, the old voice of God. We have first-person voices that read the letters and the journals and the diaries and the newspaper accounts. And then we have that complicated sound effects and the music. And so all of those 8, they're really 80 or 800, but you could simplify them, boil them down to those 8 things, have been the kind of grist for my mill for almost 40 years of practicing. And if you do that, I think, authentically, organically, conscientiously, honorably, whatever the word you want to add, then you have a style. And so I think all of these things, and because we live in a media culture, they kind of bounce off each other and affect one another. But we live up in Walpole, New Hampshire, and try to keep sort of free of a lot of the distractions and just put our heads down and work hard on trying to make that past, that moment, that story, that person, that event come alive.
Right. Could you take us through a particular scene or a series of images where all this becomes concrete and familiar for us?
Well, I don't think there's not a scene where that is
Right.
that kind of interplay. I mean, you said contemplative, I think, at the beginning,
Yes.
and that's nice, but like there's a lot of stuff that's extremely fast-paced from the first film to the last. But I think it's more often than not the fact that there are places where we've stopped and asked our audience to spend a little bit more time. The human brain, we know, can physiologically receive an image in a 48th of a second or less. I mean, that's the persistence of vision of 24 frames a second. Half of those 24 frames, you're in complete darkness as the shutter pulls the next frame down and the shutter has gone in place and put black there. So for 1 second, you see an image for a 48th of a second, and you could recognize if it was a house or a tree or something like that. But persistence of vision is just a physiological happenstance. It is not meaning. And meaning, as we all know, accrues in duration. The work you're proudest of, the relationships you care about the most have benefited from our sustained attention. So I was just trying to figure out, there was that reception of the image, then there was enough to say, I get it, and then there was something else that happened afterwards. And I've been interested in whatever that is, that's something else that happens afterwards. Right. And that does not necessarily fit nicely into earlier in my professional life an MTV mode of quick-paced music video or a YouTube video of kittens and a ball of yarn. But it does, I mean, actually that's not true. Sometimes we'll look at a ball of yarn and a kitten for an awfully long time.
How's that for a segue to your questions, a kitten and a ball of yarn? Do we have any questions that you want to pose? Please.
I'm sure we can hear you. I'll repeat the question.
Yes. So I wouldn't normally ask questions in this kind of venues, but
Everybody's so shy. You felt you had to.
I'll give you my question first, and then I'll explain where I'm coming from in 2 different ways. So how do you deal with the white man's burden in representing something as a documentarian? That's my question. And I'm asking this for 2 different reasons. As a film fan, I cannot but wonder course called Cinema and Diversity. It's a really cool course. It's a major requirement for all film majors. And we've been reading a lot about white privilege and racial relations in the United States, in contemporary culture, and politics of representations and documentary. And I know some of this group, really hardworking young people, are finding it difficult, this concept of white privilege and what to do with that as a filmmaker, or one of these, right? So any word of advice from you would be quite.
Well, that's quite a complicated and loaded question, too. White man's burden refers to a period in history where white men who controlled everything believed they could control everything. I am a white man, but not born into that period. So by applying that to me, you prejudice your question with the presumption that I then carry the brief for white men, which is not necessarily true, and a close reading, as the Academy likes to say, of my work would disprove that in the extreme. But I think a larger point that you make about diversity and privilege and all of the dangers of that, I'll just would direct you to the fact that almost all of my work deals with race in the United States. I don't have to do that as a white man, as my burden would free me from that. But in fact, I do, and I've taken a lot of grief and get a lot of hate mail and get a lot of threatening things and have all of my professional life, but I still feel that race is at the center of this. I've made films on women's issues, and I'm also the father of 4 daughters, which changes the dynamic of how you see the world and what you do. I think it's a huge problem, and I think we're waking up to the fact that there are lots of voices. I would have to back up and maybe not so much challenge your assumptions, but look at where the Academy has been in the last 75 years, for example, after the Second World War, which is, of course, the greatest catastrophe and the underlining theme of why we're here today. The greatest catastrophe in human history. Narrative seemed completely inadequate, understandably inadequate. And so within the academic academy, at least, we replaced historiography, the way we look at history, with a set of new sort of glasses, new lenses. And the first was a kind of Freudian, sexual Freudian interpretation. It was, speaking of white man's burden, and then it was followed by a Marxist economic determinist view, followed by symbolism and semiotics and deconstruction and postmodernism and queer studies and women's study, all of that sort of thing. And what we found out is that narrative, that old sort of bankrupt form, actually turned out to be a pretty good vessel if it was willing to understand not just the top-down white man's burden view of history, but a bottom-up one, which is the one we have always tried to do. So my white man burdenness is just an accident of my birth, and I spend every day trying to shed that. There are some practical questions I think we could get into, and hopefully your students and those people involved would like to engage those things. But we are all, of course, prisoners of the accidents of our birth. And I think that our work is very much evidence of the possibility of being able to escape the specific gravity of those kinds of prisons and myophias.
Other questions? Please.
Just wondering, at what point in your career did you realize that you made it as a filmmaker?
So first of all, I made a film on Huey Long, my third film, and I had the great privilege of getting to know and becoming friends with Robert Penn Warren, who wrote a novel many people put up there with the top 10 novels written by white men of the great American novel called All the King's Men. And he was an extraordinary presence in the film, but more so in my life. And at one point he looked at me and he said, "Careerism is death," just like that. And so I never used the word career again in my life, unless I'm consciously using it in reference to this story. So I say in my professional life, it feels better. His implication is that what we do to serve a career is imprisoning and limiting, and that what we need to do is as I discovered in the writings of Emerson, do whatever inly rejoices. He says in his essay on self-reliance, which is a terrific essay, which you've probably been made to read, but you might want to read it again when nobody's holding a gun to your head. It's pretty interesting sort of psychological declaration of independence. And at one point he has, this sort of gesture to say to everyone around you, oh father, oh mother, oh lover, oh husband, oh wife, from now on I will be independent. It's a great declaration of the independence of the soul. And he says, I will from now on do whatever inly rejoices. So I've tried to do that. Moving to New Hampshire was a big deal, but I don't know whether there's a moment or whether you ever really feel there's a moment that you've made it. There's an article in the New York Times today that suggests one of the people running for president has always had this paralyzing insecurity despite an amazing life of braggadocio and apparent great wealth. So I'm not sure if making it ever really means anything in that sense. The Civil War, which was my 6th or 7th film, was a big deal. It kind of, before you were born, it kind of changed everything about documentaries and changed my life in really profound ways. And the only thing that I think saved me was living up here and realizing that any amount of making it or notoriety or celebrity plus a couple bucks got me a cup of coffee, in Walpole, New Hampshire. That was always a pretty good thing. And so then I think both the idea of career and making it become themselves red herrings. That if you are doing whatever inly rejoices, then you have a possibility to be deeply and richly satisfied by things that don't fit the definition of our society's notion of a successful career or even making it. Do you know what I'm saying? And so, we are proud of our country for having thrown off the tyranny of Great Britain and now replaced it with a media culture in which we are enslaved to the tyranny of bold-faced names, right? That's like having royalty. We have it. We think that they're better than us, and there's only communication in this world among equals, and any power arrangement that in any way disrupts that equation of equality is, necessarily corrupt. And so I would just be maybe challenging the basic assumptions of making it. I actually live in the same house I live in when I was so poor that I heated my house in New Hampshire during the winter entirely by wood. And I still live in the same bedroom, and so there's been lessons learned, and I'm very happy to say about being in this area with regard to career and making it. I still have to put on my pants the same way.
Kathleen?
Well, I'm Kathleen. So you said earlier that you were interested in the moment after people see an image or hear a piece of history and like what your brain does after that and kind of formulating ideas from that. So how do you say you would want your documentaries to help us understand things?
So I think you've just asked a super question for yourself. I was saying that I looked at a still photograph and saw it as the representation of a frozen moment that itself back then had a past and would have a future. Those troops would march by. Those cannons might fire. That bat might crack. That crowd might cheer. And that's what I'm interested in. With regard to my own films, this gets into the notion of process. I'm in the job, the thing that I like is practicing, is just trying to make whatever film I'm working on better. I like the idea of putting my head on my pillow at night and knowing at least one of the several films we're working on got a little bit better that day, or at least I thought so. I can wake up the next morning and go, what were you thinking? But at least have that illusion of having made a contribution to that. You guys, so interesting to have the films play. You mark a film by its release. That's the moment in which my film is no longer mine, but actually yours. So that's really a question back to you about what these things do. They go back to the first question of, these have a durability. Do they actually represent and suddenly in their totality perpetuate a kind of tyranny of white man's burden on everybody else, subtly, unconsciously, intentionally, whatever it might be. But I really much rather work on a film than actually finish it. We've been working for 10 years on a film about the Vietnam War. It's 10 episodes, it's 18 hours. We know when it'll be on, starting September 17th next year for either 10 straight days or 5 days and a couple days off and then another 5 days, whatever PBS decides. But we don't want to finish it. We're so deep and in the woods that every time we find a mistake, we go, great, let's correct this mistake. It's not 4 days, it's 3 days. It wasn't odds of 1 in 3, but 1 in 2. And that's, we're constantly testing with our scholars and with ourselves and the available scholarly work what's happening and trying to get another perspective to honor the variety of perspectives that war would necessarily, to tell a good portrait of it, speak of. But once it's done, it's funny, it then goes out. It's like you guys, it's like your parents dropped you off here. You're going to still have a relationship with them, but it's over. The first part is over, and whatever you do from then on is really yours. Do you know what I'm saying? So I don't have that. I'm more interested in. Let me tell you a better cop-out, because I've been copping out to your question. So Duke Ellington, who in my mind is the greatest composer in American history, he's certainly the most prolific, over 2,500 compositions. Somebody asked him, what's his most important composition? And he said, the one I'm working on. Right? And so that's it. It's not like, I will forever be known by the Civil War or the Brooklyn Bridge or whatever it is, but it's really right now, what today. And so I spent about an hour and a half reading narration. I'm the narrator for a while in the editing room until we're done editing and we bring in the real narrator for 2 films that we're working on. One is an 8-part, 16-hour film on the history of country music, and the other is a 1-part film on a biography of a hospital, the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So I was rewriting and writing narration and then going into the narration booth and reading it for however long it took. That was the real work I did today. But I have to admit, I love having these conversations with you guys too. Now we got a lot.
We've got 3. Let's go for the. Should I follow your thumb?
Okay, I'm going to decide. You're first.
There you go.
I was just curious about how it is you go about picking the subject matter for your films. Like, is it stuff that you personally are interested in, or you get asked to do it?
Well, we don't have any clients, so nobody sort of asks us in the sense, will you make this film for us? Mainly they're self-initiated. That is, I come up with the idea. They're influenced by other things. In the case of the film today that we're talking about, a dear, dear friend brought an incomplete film to me and asked me to sort of run the last lap with it, and that's very rare. Mostly it's within the circle of friends through conversations. And you have, 20 or 30 films you're thinking about, and because I'm crazy, there are about 6 or 7 that we're actually working on right now, and I've signed up with PBS through 2030, so now we're blocking out roughly what the 2020s will look like. And they're all things that are about the United States. They are all things that I don't know about and want to know more about. I mean, if I tell you what I already know, and my documentary is merely the expression of an already arrived at end, I have essentially assigned you homework. But if I share with you my process of discovery, hey, you will never believe what I just learned, that's different. And it liberates itself in lots of ways that we've talked about today. So they come from within, and within is a kind of myself and then a kind of loose association of people I've worked with, and every once in a while something comes in over the transom, and then you have to let them know that it will become wholly our own, that we will sort of, omnivorously attach ourselves to it and try to do it. That's the glib thing is also that they choose me. If I were given 1,000 years to live, I would not run out of topics in American history. Yes, you're next. You know what? I hope I've just gotten better as a filmmaker. You would have to be the judge of that, looking at the Brooklyn Bridge film and looking at, you know, Jackie Robinson or the Sharpe's War or this Vietnam film coming out. We've tried to keep the process the same, and the process is the same. Just as when you study the nature of story, you can go back to Aristotle's Poetics and understand it's all there, you know, and then. Somebody says, "How was your day, dear?" Doesn't begin, "I back slowly down the driveway, avoiding the garbage can at the curb." Unless, of course, somebody T-bones you as you pull out in the street, and then that's exactly the way you tell it. We edit experience. We superimpose over the seemingly random chaos of human events some order, some narrative, some story. It is, of course, informed always, and it cannot help but be informed by who we are, the accidents of our birth. Where we were born, what language we spoke, what religion we were in, what gender we are, what, you know, sexual preference we are, what race we are, all of these things, right? So that's sort of how it goes. It's just telling stories. So for us, what we did is we liberated ourselves from what was imposed on us by our profession, which was you had a set research period. Right? 3 weeks or 3 months, followed by a set writing period in which you digested whatever you had researched and turned it into a script. 3 weeks, 3 months. And then from that, like the tablets coming down from Moses on Mount Sinai, you then shoot to that script and then edit to that, boom, done. So we never stop researching, as my story about Vietnam, which was locked, by the way, that's the term in the editing room, when you agree not to edit a single thing, change a single frame, locked a year ago. We've unlocked every episode and changed it as we want to be corrigible. We want to find out new things, right? We want to just keep making it a little bit better and a little bit better. You know what it's like scrambling to clean up your apartment if something important's about to come through the door, right? Right? And you're not going to stop until the very last moment. That's the way we feel. So we've exploded that myth and liberated ourselves from that tyranny. And so our process remains strangely the same. I mean, I can remember the Brooklyn Bridge. We locked it, and then that was this analog day where if you unlocked a film, you had just caused the most incredible headache for all the editors, because if you change 2 frames, you had to change 2 frames. When you're editing, you're doing it with the picture and maybe 1 or 2 soundtracks. But when you lock, you then do sound editing, and you may have 30 or 40, or in the case of Vietnam, 140 soundtracks. So if you're analog and you change 2 frames, you have to change 2 frames 40 different places, and it drives the editors crazy. That's why you lock it, meaning I'm not going to touch it anymore. So our process has been pretty much the same, I'm really happy to say. And technologies have come and gone. We've been very, very resistant to new technologies in the beginning, kind of suspicious or skeptical, and waited a while for them to come so that it wouldn't be a technological tail wagging the dog. I mean, I have lots of friends who make documentaries and they waste all their energy in a title sequence, you know? We just put up a white letters with maybe a red line under it and say, let's go, come on. You know, we don't need to do anything more than that. We ought to be spending our energy and our effort in the content from the first frame to the last frame, and not in the kind of bells and whistles which we all get distracted by, you know? So I think for us, the old-fashioned process, and stories remain stories, and then, are pretty good ways to do it. So we've tried to surrender or submit ourselves to those ancient forms in order to liberate ourselves from the periodic tyrannies of fashion that happen, not just in historiography, as I mentioned, but also in technological changes and in other ways. Does that help? Okay. Third. Hi.
Curious about, given the subject matter of your films, what drives you to go the documentary route rather than narrative? And could you talk a little about your relationship with the documentary form?
So that's a really good question. I had wanted to be a feature filmmaker, and I think that was a perfectly legitimate thing. I wanted to be a filmmaker starting when I was 12, and I went to Hampshire College down the road in Amherst, Massachusetts in 1971, and all of the teachers in the film department were social documentary still photographers, primarily. And they reminded me, quite correctly, that there is as much drama in what is and what was as anything the human imagination dreams of. And that because of that accident of birth, if you will, I found myself sort of switching over to documentary. But it doesn't mean that you can't get to the same place or to the same feelings or to the same kinds of truths in dramatic stuff. I've become friends, I'm very happy to say, over the last several years with Steven Spielberg. And we sort of woke up about 3 years ago and he just said, man, you and I are the same thing. And I said, yeah, we have to obey the same laws of storytelling. And he goes, yeah. And I said, you could just make stuff up. I didn't say stuff. I said, you can just make stuff up, and I can. He goes, yeah. And it was just this amazing correspondence when you realize that at the end of the day, storytelling, whether it's a quilt, a symphony, a documentary, and a film, I mean, documentary and film, the difference is so little compared to, say, a ballet or something other artistic expression. But all of them are essentially stories and what we communicate. So it's just becomes the accident of my birth that I happen to be, sitting before you as a documentary filmmaker and not a feature filmmaker. And I don't think there's any real difference. It was implied to me early on, after the first film I made was nominated for an Academy Award, that suddenly I would leave New Hampshire and I would move back to New York or to LA. And I said, yeah, I'm not going. And that was the best decision. I used to think for many, many years the best decision I ever made was to leave New York and come here. That was the second best decision. The best decision was to stay when all of the advice suggested that I should go someplace else, because it's kept the process free and allowed us to grow, I think, not just me as an artist, but I think the community of people that have grown up around us. And it's been, as you know, at firsthand, a really interesting family kind of dynamic in Walpole that's, changed, and people have come and gone over the years. Some have stayed, a semester, some have stayed 3 or 4 years, some have stayed their lives. And it's been hugely wonderful for, I know for me, and I think for the others who've stayed as well.
Let's go back in the corner, please.
I was just wondering, have you ever encountered an instance where you clashed with one of your producers on any information you found, historically speaking? Like, do you find something that you want to tell the world, but your producer said people don't want to hear that? And have you ever pushed for like a sort of historical angle or aspect on it?
Well, I am the producer, so you're talking about arguments, but it's a great question because I have those arguments with myself all the time, and a lot of it has to do with trying to understand and to free oneself from whatever baggage and bias and preconceptual and conceptual wisdom that you bring or that the subject itself suggests. Another thing is a desire on my part, quite apart from my personal public speaking, not to put any politics in the film, right? Politics are really small, binary, ones and zeros, right? It's just, it doesn't have the depth of art in it, and it's limiting, and it limits your audience necessarily. Michael Moore is considered a great documentary filmmaker, but he only he preaches to one congregation, and nobody ever looked at Fahrenheit 9/11 and said, wow, I'm a huge supporter of our president, but I am now convinced that this war in Iraq is really bad, and I'm now going to quit the Republican Party. And nor did anyone in Bowling for Columbine say, I am a card-carrying member of the NRA, but this is absolutely right. I am going to tear up my card and melt down my guns into plowshares and do something else. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And I've felt that I've wanted to speak to everybody, wherever they come from, whatever their orientation, and that there were things that we shared in common together. And that history was a table around which we could still have a civil discourse. Bill O'Reilly, do you know who that is? Do you know who Rachel Maddow is? They both love Abraham Lincoln genuinely. And that's not a bad place to start, right? So I find often in the course of making the films that you are wrestling always with those preconceptions, those of us who make it. It isn't just singularly myself. With the preconceptions, the baggage that we bring, whatever the accidents of birth are, and you're sort of fighting against it. I've just finished a film on the Vietnam War, and it is really long, and it's really tough, and it has almost nothing of what I thought happened, and I grew up in it. I had a high draft number. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the first teach-in happened, where the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, you may have heard of, was formed. Tom Hayden, who died a couple days ago, went to the University of Michigan. He was the, I felt I knew it, and I knew nothing about it. So for us, it's the combination of liberating ourselves from that preconception, but also sort of filtering through the stuff that would be just mere advocacy, if that makes it. I mean, you can look at our Civil War film and you could see that we're against slavery. And I'm unapologetic about that. If you're for slavery, and believe you me, there are movements in graduate schools in this country and elsewhere which wish to strike a completely amoral stance, right? We cannot actually say that slavery is bad. We can only say that it was an event. We cannot say the Holocaust was bad. We can only say that it was an event that happened, and we need to understand how it happened and what happened from it. But that's no different than the guy who invented the mechanical reaper, right? I disagree. I disagree. There's some human moral things that we can say, and we felt it important to sort of say that slavery was bad. But other than that, we sort of tried to put our arms around all views of the Civil War, South as well as North, and pro-slavery as well as slavery. Not that we subscribed to it. It was very clear that we were very happy that the North won and the Union was kept together, and more importantly, that slavery ended. But, for the most of the other stuff, we actually found, interestingly enough, that all of those historiographical perspectives were like the blind man describing one part of the elephant, right? And that you needed a kind of unified view. And it's interesting in our Vietnam film, which is not without passion or art or other things, that a lot of different perspectives can coexist within it. That there are people in it on the American side who feel that we should still be there fighting the commies. And there are people in the film who feel that they knew from the moment and practiced with their, not just their mouths, but their bodies against the war from the very beginning. And they coexist in the film, and nobody's shamed or whatever. It's just different points of view. And I like the fact that narrative, now as we understand it today, much more inclusive and diverse, is able to present a nuanced and complicated narrative that allows all those different views that you're talking about to coexist. Did that answer it? Okay.
If we can move down the row, your hand.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question because everything is subjective. We like to pretend the documentaries are objective. Let's just throw that out. There's no objectivity except for God, and she's not telling. So, we'll just have to do it. So you get drawn to a subject. Why is it in a relatively small college that you can probably recognize all your classmates' faces? You probably know at least half their names, right? Your acquaintances with several dozen, your friends with a couple dozen, and 2 or 3 will probably be friends of yours for life. And how does that happen? And a lot of it, the correct answer would be proximity. Same classes, same dorm or dorm room, things like that. But for the most part, we don't know how that chemistry takes place. So we're drawn to a subject and we have to start somewhere. The Civil War, I had been reading over and over again at the end of Civil War books about the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant in a little crossroads town called Appomattox Courthouse. And they did it in the living room of a guy named Wilmer McLean. Footnote, down at the bottom of the page. Interestingly enough, Wilmer McLean had once lived in Manassas, Virginia, where the first Battle of Bull Run had been fought, and he left there after that battle. I went, what? Why is this at the end of the story? So our Civil War series begins with, by the summer of 1861, Wilmer McLean had had enough. The first major battle of the Civil War, Bull Run, or Manassas, as the Confederates called it, had raged across the aging Virginians' farmland, a Union shell going so far as to explode in the family kitchen. Now McLean moved his family far south and west of Richmond, out of harm's way, he prayed, to a dusty little crossroads. And it was there, 2.5 years later, that Lee surrendered to Grant, and Wilmer McLean could rightfully say that the war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. We were saying 1,000 different things about the personal story we were going to tell. That was the last time we told you the outcome of the war was in the first minute. From then on, it was not sure how it was going to turn out. And we could have gone a million different ways, right? This is the most important event in American history, the Civil War. We could have started it 1,000 different ways. And so what happens is you become mindful of the sets of decisions you make as you make those decisions. And that's the only thing you can do. And sometimes you can wake up and retrace your step. What you've done has been an either artistic or a narrative cul-de-sac, a dead end, and you need to back up and figure out a new way to do that. And this applies not just to the easy, for me to recall how you begin a film, but all the millions of decisions you make in the middle of it. A lot of it is just the luck and serendipity of meeting somebody who then gives you a great interview and says, have you talked to this person, right? And this person, and you go to them, or you go to this archive and they say, you know, who also has a good collection is this person, right? So our proximity, for example, to Keene State College for the Sharps War has been incredibly fortuitous in lots of different ways to how we've done the production, from the early sort of carriers of the DNA of this project to the support of the Coens who made it possible for us to finish the film. You know, I mean, all of that is kind of random, how you choose it, and the same thing that you're drawn to a subject. I remember I knew in about one instant that I was going to do a film on the national parks. I mean, it took me literally a second to say yes wholeheartedly. A film I'd done with the co-producer on that film, Dayton Duncan, the previous film that we'd done together called Horatio's Drive, he'd been talking to me about it for 10 years, and for 10 years I went, yeah, like that. And then we did it. At some point I went, right, like that. So between the decisions you make in the film and just the decisions to make a film are very random and haphazard and fortuitous and serendipitous and all those things.
Who's next? How about here on the aisle?
I have a question about how you really started out. Kind of like, was it hard finding your footing? Like, were you certain you wanted to do documentary, or really, how did you find your way?
Yeah, it's hard. And my advice is always just sounds like a platitude, you know, to know who you are, the Socratic challenge, and also to persevere. I'm very, very lucky because I knew at age 12 I wanted to be a filmmaker. By age 19 I knew I wanted to make documentaries, and by 22 or 23 I knew it was going to be in history. And none of those were foreseen, but to have that early on. But I did have to move out of New York City up here where I could live for $2,500 a year, which is what I lived on in 79 and 80. It was really, really tough. And I, you know, never have worked for anybody, and that's made it really difficult. For a while when we were trying to raise the money for the Brooklyn Bridge film, we just took day jobs. I got paid $150 a day, but that would be for one day to be a cameraman for the BBC somewhere in New England, in which they wanted to get away without paying us per diems, meaning wherever the shoot was in New England, we had to get there and not charge them a hotel room, which means we'd wake up at 2 a.m. and arrive on the location at 7 in the morning in northern Maine or, you know, some place, and then shoot all day and then drive home. And that happened a lot. And if you could put 2 or 3 of those days together, you could pay the rent and have a little food. So it was really, really tough. But I think the key was perseverance. That first film that I made, Brooklyn Bridge, I used to keep for about 20 years 2 big, you know, 5 or 6 inch thick 3-ring binders that sat on my desk, and they were all the rejections for all. I wrote letters. This back, you won't believe it, there's a thing called typewriters, and you couldn't correct a mistake you made. You had to use either this liquid to erase it, or you had to stamp it over with a piece of paper, and I would type out these letters, and if I made a mistake, I'd sometimes have to throw the letter away and start again, asking for money, and I had enough rejections to fill 2 3-ring binders that I used to just keep there going, you know, I am not here because of talent, but because of perseverance. And that's been the the main thing. And I think that's a hugely important thing to understand, particularly in documentary, because there doesn't seem to be a career path. If you wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or a feature filmmaker, I could probably tell you pretty accurately the steps you should take in order to do that. But every documentary filmmaker I know has arrived at their position from a kind of completely unique set of circumstances, career kind of decisions. And that's probably what makes it both terrifying and great, too. That's the good thing and the scary thing. Yes?
Going back to what you were saying before, how do you know or when do you know that a film you're working on is finished?
Yeah, you know, there's a very, very famous, I don't know who it's attributed to. It says, you don't finish a work of art, you abandon it. And there's so much truth in that, and I can't begin to tell you how much that feels true. You sort of, and the implication there is that you could work on it to death, right? And then there is nothing left. And I've seen that happen to things. So it's a very real, it isn't an abstract thing. So it's fortunately a collaborative medium, so when the lights come up, you're looking at other people and you're testing. And the hardest thing, I think, of all is to be true to a weak little voice in yourself that says, not working, or didn't get it, or why do you think that? And it's often drowned out by your desire that you want it to work. And very logical things. You know what this is like in relationships, right? You want it to work out, right? And you're convincing yourself, and you kind of overwhelm sometimes that voice that maybe after the fact you say, I should have listened to. So I think it's, if there's anything, if the process hasn't changed, it's been that relationship to the process that might have gotten a little bit finer as we've gone along, to remember to hear that voice, to listen for it, and to go, uh-oh, and to bring in people who are, we call them warm bodies. It sounds horribly, inhuman, but a warm body to us is somebody that's not a filmmaker and doesn't have any expertise in the subject, so is sort of ignorant about what we're about to shoot. And then you sit behind them and you watch when they fuss or, recross their legs or, shift in their seat. It just speaks volumes, and you learn a lot about your films. And now I'm talking towards at the end at a very subtle level when you stop doing it. We're having huge conversations right now in Vietnam because, as you can imagine, even though it's 18 hours long, it's such a huge and complex subject, we've left lots of things out. And there's that last moment where you go, boy, I could get those things in. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Amadeus. There's a wonderful scene when the emperor says, too many notes, right? And it is the total height of pretension, but it's a really good thing for us. And I have on every film, I have an example of taking out a scene that was actually terrific, that was in some ways better than the two adjacent scenes, but itself was destabilizing to the larger thing. And it's been incredibly hard to do. And so that the cutting room floor, the proverbial cutting room floor, but also the literal cutting room floor, is always filled with good scenes, not bad scenes, good scenes, sometimes great scenes. And yet they get sacrificed all the time, all the time. I just had one of our advisors in Vietnam, we took out this wonderful scene. If I described it to you, you go, you are such an idiot to take this thing out. It was so good, but it just didn't fit. It was too many notes within an already very dense and rich and complicated episode. And he kept arguing for us to put this back in, and I'm going, Tommy, it's not going to happen. I love the scene. We'll put it in the DVD extras if that'll make you happy. But at some point, somebody, and in the case of my films, that would be me, says, you know what, we're done. And there's just so much you can fuss. And in every film I've done, there's always that point, once you've said that, is yikes. Now, in the case of Vietnam, because it's such a controversial subject, you want to make sure that you don't give ammunition to anybody who might be disposed to find fault with it by having a stupid mistake of it's 3 and not 4, and it's 2 and not 3 and that sort of thing. So we've just literally, though we've done it all the way through fact check, you can go, every time we fact check, we can find something. And finally I got to the point where I just said, okay, we've had this argument over this figure all along. I'm just going to decide and I'll answer the letters. You know, we're just going to say this because 6 scholars have 6 different numbers.
Yes, right here.
I'm wondering, or I'm just really curious, as a documentary filmmaker versus a feature filmmaker, when you're coming up with ideas for your creative process, and you start to become like, if I'm sure you've been, at some point in the last like 30 years in a creative rut where you just don't know how to, show a certain subject, of history, or just how to like make it interesting, or to, like the way you want to say it. So I'm wondering, because I know, like some writers that I follow, like Aaron Sorkin says, like when he's in this creative rut, he'll take 5 to 6 showers a day and like put on a new pair of clothes, and then he'll like, sit down at his desk, and then he'll see like what he can write then. Maybe he'll have a new idea. So my question is that if you're stuck in this creative rut, how do you like refresh your ideas or try to get out of the norm?
It's a really good question, and probably one more to a feature film that is dependent on the originality of the script, that is to say, the human imagination, right? I don't have that luxury. It's got to be stuff that happened, right? Emphasis on happened, not happening, because I tend to do American history. But I think it's really, I wear a lot of hats. I'm the executive producer, I'm the director, I'm the producer, I'm sometimes the co-writer, I direct music, I do all this thing, I supervise the editing, I'm on top of the process. But the one thing I do is I'm able to see the film pretty neutrally every time I'm working on it, so I can actually say, it needs this or it needs that. So when we look at something and it's really bad, I feel the happiness. When it's really good and everybody's giving each other high fives, that's when I get really nervous. So it's not a rut. And I'm working on lots of things at once, several projects, which have the effect of distracting me long enough so that I will leave a horrific editing set of few weeks with Vietnam and then go to Nashville and shoot country music interviews for a week and collect archives there and then clear the brain, and then I'm in New York working on something else, and then I'm back up here and I'm screening the Sharps War and we're giving notes for that, and then we're going back into Vietnam, and by that time, in some ways, I'm just completely clean and I can receive it. So I feel lucky that there hasn't been this thing. In the very early days where we didn't know how to edit, right? Because our films are not, Aaron Sorkin's films, because he's a wordsmith, are made in the script. And everything that comes after it are not insignificant, and the editing's important and the shooting's important, but nothing is more important in our work than editing. We can collect the greatest interviews ever made. We can collect rare and never before seen archives, as we like to say, and it doesn't mean anything unless you know how to put it together. So I've been stuck in the editing room, and I figure out something to at least try. And a lot of it has to do with the limitations of our craft. In the old analog days, I have to say, is this giving the editor 2 hours or 2 days worth of work? Today, that is now 2 minutes and 2 hours because of editing. But that in itself creates a set of problems because you can have a tyranny of choices. They can say, I've had an editor say, I just did it 6 different ways. I said, I don't want to see 6 different ways. Just do it one way, right? And then let's see if that was a good way, because 6 different ways tells you that there can be a tyranny of choice as well as there can be a tyranny of no choice. Do you know what I'm saying? That's a huge problem, particularly in our digital age, where you can so easily make clones and replicants that have only minor differences from the last. I'd almost prefer going through the old-fashioned way at that point, where there was a there, where you could hold your work, Brent. You cut the film with a razor blade and you Scotch taped it together. That had a reality to something physical and tangible. Every job now on earth is a keyboard and a mouse, right? Yeah, except for painters, but even they're, you know what I mean? They wear smocks because the stuff gets on them. That's so great. I'd love that maybe there'd be blood in the editing room or something.
Yes, please.
As a young filmmaker, I feel like there's a lot of anxiety in undergrad
Never did. I'm still anxious. That's the question, isn't it? It goes back to what I was saying a second before, but you said it so beautifully. You know, we have the idea of the career or the professional life, and we're drawn to certain things, sometimes more than one thing, and that creates its own kind of confusion. But if we're drawn to, say, one thing, and we're in a film class and we're wanting to know, and the essential thing that we're asking is, do I have something to say? Right? I mean, that's, if you strip away a lot of the superficial anxieties, you know, is this going to be good? Or are my friends going to admire me? Is the teacher going to give me a good grade? All these things. It comes back to, do I have something to say? And it's really an important question. That's the Socratic thing. Who am I? Do I, in fact, have something to say? And only you can answer that. Only you can do the means testing to say yes. And there is absolutely no shame in saying, you know what? I don't think I have something to say. I'd rather go do something else. And maybe I'll be better if I did this or this. Or to stick it out. And it may have been cowardice on my part. You know, in the Vietnam War, we're dealing with two forms of courage. One is courage on the battlefield. One is courage not to go to the battlefield. And I'm not sure you can decide which is the more courageous, right? With that war, right? I mean, it's excuse me, I can hear Louis Armstrong singing. I was sitting on my phone and Louis Armstrong turned on. But do you know what I'm saying? I mean, we've interviewed guys who charged up hills and got wounded, and we've interviewed people who drove across the border to Canada and became Canadian citizens. And who's to say what's more courageous? So I think that the idea of the tension between perseverance and who am I is a really good set of questions to be asking all the time. And I'd be more worried if you weren't anxious, you know, because I'm anxious. I'm 63, I'm a grandpa. I'm anxious all the time about this stuff. And that's good, you know, I think. And maybe there's somebody else. I mean, maybe there's a way to just sort of greet each dawn with some new possibilities, and each day is better than the next. And I do have a great deal of enthusiasm for what I do, but at the same time, there's a good deal of questioning and skepticism and anxiety about it. So I would say that would be healthy.
We've got time for one more question, so you've had your hand up.
I was just wondering, what would you give to students or young filmmakers alike who not only want to make features or narrative documentaries, who don't want to wait to the next class or the next assignment to work on something? They want to make something right then and there, if they have time or anything like that.
Well, I go back still to the two things, perseverance and the Socratic, who am I? But I think that there's something false about the age in which we live in, because we all have this, and we can make movies. I mean, we can take motion pictures, I should say. It's actually not motion pictures, but some digital approximation of what used to be motion pictures. And we can take still photographs, though they're just digital representations of what used to be film process. We think that we know how to do it, and we don't. We're good collectors, we're good, you know, filmers of things on the fly, but we're not necessarily even good aggregators, let alone good editors and narrative storytellers. It's a much smaller subset. So submitting to the discipline of college or school of some form, to the, particularly in film, whatever way you choose, the collaborative nature of it with fellow students is a good way to do the kind of refining with regard to that anxiety and impatience, but also to understand stuff. I was taught by, as I said, social documentary still photographers, which you'd think would be weird for filmmakers. They did films, but they weren't, you know, they were interested in larger things. They were interested in history. They were interested in humanities. They were interested in ethics. They were interested in the dynamics of taking a single photograph, that if I took your photograph, I was in some ways taking something from you, what reciprocity was then required in that moment. And it may just be a form of human communication or recognition or a spark of communication that takes place, could more than suffice for that reciprocity. What happens when you appropriate an image? What happens when you film a murder? If you film a murder, you're unable to stop it. There are lots of ethical dilemmas that arise. And so they were very interested in exposing us to a wide range. And I haven't said even history, you know? Like when people ask me who my favorite films and filmmakers are, I rarely list documentaries. I think of them all as feature films, but I don't see the distinction, you know? The film we made, the Central Park Five, I was talking to somebody about it earlier today, I made with my daughter and my son-in-law, and we won the New York Film Critics Circle Award, and they have the habit of asking some celebrity to come and introduce the film. And to our great fortune, they got Chris Rock, who stood up and said almost exactly what I've said. He goes, oh my God, there's Steven Spielberg, and oh my God, there's this person, this person. He said, listen, you guys like to make a distinction between a feature film in Hollywood or what's on TV. You like to make a decision between a feature-length film and a big series. You like to make a distinction between drama and comedy. You like to make a distinction between documentary and feature. I don't think distinctions exist. This is the best film I've seen this year, and drop the mic. Which is the best introduction we've ever had, which is like, yeah, thank you, Stephen. And, you know, it was great. So I think that we need each other, and we need to submit to the processes of learning. And if there's anything that I do know that I have learned, is that I'm still learning. Today, I've had a whole set of questions. We have a line in the Vietnam film about someone leaking to the New York Times information about the secret bombing of Cambodia. Wait for the film. You don't need to go Google this. And ours said Nixon and Kissinger immediately ordered illegal wiretaps on 17 reporters and folks in the government. And I said, even though this has been vetted 100 times by all our historians, I said, did they both really approve it? I said that yesterday in New York. And we've spent the entire day going through sources, trying to determine whether we can say that or just the White House ordered. You understand what I'm saying? That just comes from having other people to bounce stuff off of. So I think particularly the cure for that impatience is a little bit more patience. Sorry. It just kind of sounds like what your parents might say too. Sorry.
Dear friends, we are at our time period. We've got another event that Ken needs to get to. So he's not going to be able to linger and visit with you. Dean Hottinger is going to take him to the next event. But before he goes, can we express our appreciation for this time?